There's an old story about the invention of the game of chess. And as an avid chess player, I've heard it told countless times in countless different ways. And the story goes that the inventor of chess was getting fame in India. Everyone loved this new game. So he was brought before the emperor, who equally took a great shine to it and said, "I will reward you for creating such a wonderful game. Just tell me, what is it that you desire? What do you want?" Now, the emperor at this point knew that such a question could be a poisoned chalice, or such an offer at least, because if he asked for too much, he risks offending the emperor, which is a very dangerous thing to do. So rather than ask for all the wealth in India, he acts quite slyly and says, "I'm quite humble. I don't need wealth. All I need is rice to eat. So for the first square on my chessboard, I'd like you to give me 1 grain of rice. For the second square of the chessboard, I just want 2. For the third, I just want 4 grains of rice. And for the fourth, I just want 8. And I want us to repeat this pattern whereby every square on the chessboard, we will double the amount of grains of rice owed on it after the last one, until we completely finish the 64 square chessboard." Now, supposedly the emperor laughed at this and said, "I'm the emperor of India. I've got so much wealth to offer, and you ask for grains of rice on a chessboard? Take it. What are a few grains compared to the immense wealth I own?" And agreed on the spot. Now, while it is true that the emperor was very wealthy, and for the first few squares on the chessboard, it was just a few grains of rice, what the emperor didn't realize was he was actually agreeing to pay far more than he could have ever anticipated. Because by the time we get to the 11th square on the chessboard, he now owes over 1,000 grains of rice for that 1 square. For the 31st square on the chessboard, for that 1 square, he owes over 1 billion grains of rice. And we're not even halfway through the chessboard. By the time he gets to the 41st square, it's over 1 trillion grains of rice. And by the time we get to the 51st square, we're at over 1 quadrillion grains of rice. And by the time we get to the 61st square, we are at over 1 quintillion grains of rice. The amount of rice owed when we total up the entire chessboard is more rice than arguably may have ever existed in the history of the world. If you were to take the amount of grains of rice that the emperor owed and stack them up on top of each other in a big pile of rice, it would be taller than Mount Everest. If you were to cover India in a layer of rice with all of that rice, it would be over 1 meter deep. Now, the end of the story is that, well, it changes. Either the inventor retires really rich, the emperor gets deposed, or the emperor gets really angry and kills the inventor for tricking him. The ending doesn't really matter. What matters is the lesson here about compound interest. What is compound interest? Well, compound interest is what we refer to as interest earned on both your initial investment, so that's the money that you put in to the start of the investment, and earned interest on earned interest, so interest on interest. Now, I've said interest a lot, so I think perhaps it's best to put this into an example just to show you how the numbers work. So let's take an example where an investor has invested $100,000 and every year he returns 10% every year. Now, of course, that would never normally happen in the real world. You can't get 10% guaranteed growth every year, but otherwise it gets too complicated to explain. And I'm going to use 10% every year, as that is the average long-term growth rate of large cap stocks in the US. Well, in year one, our investors invested his $100,000, gets his 10% return, and earns $10,000. And he's very happy. So he keeps that $10,000 invested, and now has $110,000 invested. Year two rolls around, and he's made another 10%. But this year, he hasn't earned $10,000, he's earned more, because he's still earned 10%, but that $110,000 he now has, he's earned 10% on that. So now he's earned $11,000. As $11,000 is 10% of $110,000. Now, it might seem quite obvious to say that if you have the same percentage return each year, but your investment grows, then you'll make more money each year. And that is true. But what's not obvious is that each year these little increases at the start amass to be quite huge by the end of the investment. After year 10, we can see that $100,000 has turned into $250,000. After year 20, that will have turned into $650,000. After year 30, it will have turned into 1.7 million. So in 30 years, we've turned our initial investment into 17 times more than it was originally valued at. And what's also interesting to look at is if we look at the amount of money earned in profit, so the difference between year 29 and year 30, we can see that it was actually $158,000. So between year 29 and year 30, their investment grew by more than $158,000. That's more than the initial investment was entirely. Now, while it's not as impressive as owning all of the rice that's ever existed in history, this example really does illustrate what's achievable with compound interest. However, all of this relies on keeping the money invested. If the investor had decided to take profits out and not keep it invested, he would have never taken advantage of compound interest. Every year he would have earned $10,000, taken it out of the investment and put it back down to $100,000. So the investment would only ever grow by $10,000 every year, which means over the course of a 30-year span, that investment would have grown by 10,000 times by 30, so $300,000 to achieve a final total of $400,000 if you include the initial investment. Now compare that to the previous figure that we calculated of 1.7 million. It's clear that compound interest has incredibly large returns. Now, it must be said that these returns aren't anywhere near as much as owning all of the rice that's ever existed, ever. But as I said, that story never happened. And this is a real life example, or a really good example to show investors why it's so important. Well, one, to keep your money invested, but also to keep your money invested for as long as possible. Or another way of saying that is by starting to invest as early as possible. Because if you remember, if we go back to the chessboard example, when we got halfway through the chessboard, yes, 1 billion grains of rice in square 31 or 4 billion grains of rice for the first half of the chessboard is a lot of rice, but the emperor could afford it. It's what happens when you get to the second half of the chessboard, when you leave an investment long enough to really take advantage of compound interest, that the growth gets out of control. And if that growth is investment growth, well, then you're very rich, and that's a very good thing. Every year extra that you have to invest, your total return gets exponentially larger due to compound interest. And this is why when it comes to investing, especially with new investors, I always say that time is your biggest asset as an investor. And the most profitable investments you make tend to be the ones that you make earliest, simply because they've got the longest time to grow. Now, this is especially true for long-term goals like retirement planning. Every year you put off investing is less and less your investments have to compound. And a lot of people think of it as, what's a year of growth? What's year one of growth? It's $10,000 on the $100,000 example. But you're always going to get year one of investment growth unless you don't invest for a year. If the investor who was investing for 30 years had delayed his investment by 1 year, he wouldn't miss year one, he would miss year 30, which, if you remember, is the most profitable year and returned him $158,000. So that's what a year of inaction would have cost him. What do you think it's going to cost you? The longer you allow your investments to compound, the deeper into the chessboard you go, the more crazy your returns can be. Another way of looking at this, I suppose, is in our example of the $100,000 investment at 10% return every year. The first half of that 30-year investment returned a profit of around $317,000. But the second half returned a profit of 1.3 million. The problem is, though, is that compound interest affects more than just our investments. If it only affected our investments, it'd be amazing. But it also affects negative parts of our life. Now, just to remind you, if you're not familiar with the term, inflation is the concept that every year, everything gets more expensive by a little bit, more or less. So every year, chocolate bars go up in price. Currently, we are seeing energy bills go up in price quite a lot. We are seeing food bills go up quite a lot, all through supply factors around in the world right now. And inflation is what we use to describe that phenomenon. If we were to example, let's have a look. Take average inflation in the US over the last 60 years. It's around 3.8% every year, which doesn't sound like a lot, doesn't sound like nothing. But much like grains of rice on a chessboard, the figure sounds deceptively small until you realize that that means prices have risen over 900%. To buy the same number of goods for $100 in 1960, today it'd cost you over $1,000. It's a 10 times price rise. So going back to long-term goals like retirement planning, compound interest is kind of a double-edged sword, because while it affects your investments in a really positive way, in that the longer you leave your investments growing, they can have exponential growth and kind of get out of control if you're lucky and see huge returns. Well, the same is true for inflation, and that inflation compounding is meaning that your retirement is becoming exponentially more expensive. The problem comes when you do nothing, because when you don't invest, you're getting no compound interest. The compound interest just stops, gone, and your investments will not grow, well, because there aren't any. But inflation is going to grow no matter what. So if you have a retirement, 20, 30 years away, and you're not investing now, well, you're not just in a situation where you're missing out on that last year of investment, which is normally your most profitable, you're also having the costs associated with that retirement increase and increase. So, compound interest is great for investing, and the longer you invest, the larger your long-term gains. The only problem comes if you don't start investing. Anyway, that's been compound interest and my very tenuous grains of rice from the chessboard example. I just love the story and I wanted to tie it to a financial concept. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and as I've been told, I need to beg everyone to like and subscribe. So please, if you've enjoyed the video, please do that below. Thank you ever so much. I've been Luke Staden. Take care.